ops room is quiet except for the soft chatter of radios and the glow of orbit tracks moving across a wall of screens. A commercial satellite constellation is streaming imagery and telemetry as usual when one console begins to behave strangely.
Commands are taking longer than expected. One spacecraft is returning odd error codes. A few downlink packets do not match the usual pattern. Nothing is obviously on fire, but everything feels just off enough that the mission director has to choose a story.
Is this a glitch in the ground system, a radio frequency problem in the link, or the early stage of a deliberate attack on an asset that cannot be brought into a data center for maintenance?
That decision window is where Spaceborne Security now lives.
Welcome to Spaceborne Security, defending satellites, ground stations, and the links between. This is a Wednesday headline feature from Bare Metal Cyber magazine, developed by Bare Metal Cyber.
Over the next few minutes, we are treating satellites, ground stations, and the connections between them as what they have quietly become: critical digital infrastructure. The space segment is no longer an exotic world sitting apart from everything else. It is increasingly built from familiar components in software, subject to familiar mistakes, but deployed in an environment where latency, intermittent connectivity, and physical inaccessibility change the consequences.
For leaders in telecommunications, navigation, logistics, climate and Earth observation, defense, and finance, those differences matter more every year. The first mental shift is simple to say and harder to truly absorb. Space systems are still systems. Strip away the acronyms and the romance of launch videos, and a modern satellite begins to look familiar. The payload rides on a bus that may use commodity processors, commercial operating systems, vendor firmware, and integration code. The ground side often includes legacy hardware, Windows and Linux servers, virtualization, cloud services, and web dashboards. Even the radio path increasingly depends on software-defined radios, Internet Protocol-based backhaul, and vendor application programming interfaces that connect back into corporate networks.
Once you see that clearly, the security implications land hard.
The usual weaknesses follow you into orbit. Unpatched operating systems, weak identity and access management around operator consoles, brittle vendor integrations, supply chain blind spots in firmware and libraries, deployment pipelines that were never threat modeled from end to end.
The difference is that the same mistakes now play out where physical access is constrained, remediation windows are narrow, and mission lifetimes may last for many years. A misconfigured ground network is not just an information technology problem when it is the only channel to multiple spacecraft. It is mission risk.
Treating space assets as mystical special cases does not help. In fact, it can lead to security theater. Organizations may build elaborate controls around the satellite while ignoring basic hygiene elsewhere. They may focus heavily on anti-jamming scenarios while leaving operator remote access mostly unexamined. They may build formal command authorization procedures while vendor access into the ground environment remains loosely governed. The better approach is to bring space into existing security models. Map the satellite, ground segment, and communication links into the same attack surface inventory used for other critical systems. Ask how build pipelines, supply chain assurance, access control, and monitoring apply when a compromised ground system can affect an asset for its entire orbital life. Once you reset your view that way, the picture resolves into three tightly connected attack surfaces: the satellite in orbit, the ground segment, and the links between them.
Adversaries do not care about these boundaries. A state actor, criminal group, or motivated insider will look for the cheapest path to meaningful control or disruption. That path may run through a vendor, a ground station, a remote access tool, a software update, or the radio link itself.
Leaders who insist on separate risk assessments for each segment without asking how they interact create blind spots exactly where attackers see opportunity. On the satellite itself, the biggest risks cluster around what is built and loaded before launch and what can be influenced through commands once the satellite is in orbit. Compromised firmware, malicious supply chain changes, weak command authentication, or fragile fault management logic can all create long-lived problems. Because satellites are built to last, decisions about cryptography, key management, and update mechanisms can lock in weaknesses for a decade or more. Pre-launch integration and acceptance should not be treated only as technical milestones. They are security gates.
The ground segment has the opposite problem. It feels familiar, so people underestimate it.
Mission control networks, data processing pipelines, and supporting information technology often look like normal enterprise systems. That can be fine for some controls, but it is not fine when those systems are the single point of failure for orbiting assets and the services they support.
Exposed remote access, weak segregation between corporate and mission networks, fragile identity systems around operator consoles, and inconsistent logging are not exotic problems, but in this setting, they can have exotic consequences.
The links between space and ground add another layer. Here, leaders need to think about radio frequency interference, spoofing, protocol manipulation, uplink and downlink abuse, and attacks on the terrestrial backhaul behind antennas. An attacker may not need to compromise the satellite bus or the mission control network if they can distort, replay, or interfere with signals at the right moment. The pattern is uncomfortable but clear. An attacker needs only one weak segment to gain leverage. Defenders have to reason about all three as one integrated target. You cannot harden the satellite and leave the ground and link sides merely good enough.
It is also important to move beyond the idea that satellite compromise is always a clean, obvious event. In practice, failure modes are often messy and ambiguous, especially early in an incident. One class of failure appears as degradation of telemetry and command. Operators may see gaps in health data, commands that do not take effect, or state changes that do not match expectations. Those symptoms can come from radio conditions, buggy software updates, ground system problems, or deliberate interference. In the first hour, they may look almost identical.
Leaders who treat only total loss of contact as a serious security problem are setting their teams up to underreact. A second class of failure involves payload manipulation. For communications satellites, that might mean unauthorized transponder changes, routing shifts, or degraded quality of service for certain regions or customers. For imaging and sensing payloads, it could mean tampered imagery, altered calibration, or data that appears valid but is systematically biased. For navigation and timing systems, signal manipulation can cause position errors, time drift, or intermittent outages. Those effects can ripple into aviation, maritime operations, power grids, and financial trading. These outcomes do not look like cinematic explosions in orbit. They look like eroded trust in the services that depend on spaceborne data. The most severe category is service denial or physical harm. Intentional mispointing, unsafe maneuvers, or repeated operation outside safe limits can shorten satellite life or create collision risks. Coordinated interference with multiple spacecraft in a constellation can reduce coverage, degrade capacity, or create regional blackouts for communications, navigation, or surveillance. For leaders, the critical question is not just whether a satellite could be lost, it is how partial, slow-burning, or reversible failures could translate into safety, regulatory, contractual, and geopolitical consequences on the ground. That translation should drive how incidents are classified, what teams monitor for, and how response is practiced. Once you accept that space systems are familiar systems with unforgiving constraints, the architecture conversation becomes more concrete. Physics and mission profiles create realities that cannot be negotiated away. Long round-trip times, intermittent visibility windows, limited onboard compute, constrained power, and assets that may operate for years without physical access. Security controls that depend on low latency, constant connectivity, or frequent patching become fragile. You cannot simply export your favorite data center pattern into orbit and expect it to work. Instead, you have to prioritize controls that survive delay and disruption. Every opportunity to change software, update keys, or adjust configuration becomes precious. Command authentication and key management sit at the center of that challenge. If an attacker can inject unauthorized commands or replay old ones, everything else becomes secondary. Strong cryptographic protection on command paths is essential, but the real decisions are operational. How often can keys realistically be rotated for a mission? What happens if a key is suspected of compromise halfway through the satellite's life? Is there a secure and practiced way to update algorithms as standards and threats change? Early decisions about key hierarchy, onboard storage, and recovery procedures can lock teams into brittle patterns for years. Leaders should push for cryptographic agility, not just cryptographic strength on day one. Resilience patterns also have to account for the reality that contact will be lost, sometimes at the worst possible moment. Onboard autonomy, safe mode behavior, and fault management logic become de facto incident responders when the ground team is blind or delayed. That has security implications. Teams need to understand which conditions trigger safe mode, which commands are accepted during degraded states, and how conflicting instructions are resolved when contact returns. On the ground, buffering, delayed validation, and replay of logs and telemetry are essential for reconstructing events. They help teams separate environmental noise from deliberate interference. Architectures that assume perfect visibility tend to age badly in orbit.
A useful design question is simple. How does this system behave when we are deaf, blind, or wrong for a while?
Technology is only part of the story. The governance environment around space systems is just as important. These programs sit at the intersection of commercial ambition, national strategic interests, and international norms that are still evolving. Ground station partners, and customers in regulated sectors. On top of that, there may be export controls, spectrum management rules, safety regulations, and sometimes defense or intelligence oversight. The result is that even routine risk decisions can carry geopolitical weight. Ownership and control boundaries are especially difficult. Who owns mission risk when one company builds the bus, another operates the payload, a cloud provider runs the data pipeline, and multiple regulators oversee different parts of the operation? Contracts often lag reality. Language about cyber responsibilities, assurance levels, and incident handling may be vague or outdated. Those gaps become painfully visible during pre-launch acceptance, in the middle of anomalies, or when regulators, customers, allies, or agencies demand answers. Governance that looks tidy on an organization chart can fall apart under the combined stress of technical ambiguity and political scrutiny. Effective spaceborne security governance treats information sharing, classification, and public communication as design issues, not afterthoughts. Some incidents cannot be discussed openly, even with important partners, without triggering regulatory, diplomatic, or competitive consequences. Others may require fast coordination across national boundaries and commercial competitors to prevent debris, service collapse, or cascading impacts on critical infrastructure.
Leaders need realistic playbooks for who can say what, to whom, and under which legal authority before anything goes wrong.
Governance is not just about compliance. It is about shaping a decision environment where teams can act quickly and credibly when the stakes reach beyond a single asset or company.
At its heart, this topic is about treating spaceborne assets as part of critical digital infrastructure, not as distant curiosities. The ops room dilemma we started with is a stand-in for a deeper leadership question. Do you have a coherent model of how satellites, ground stations, and communication links create and carry risk for your organization?
Once you understand that familiar vulnerabilities now live in an environment shaped by orbits, latency, and long mission lifetimes, good enough enterprise patterns stop feeling so reassuring. You start to see where more deliberate assurance is worth paying for.
Internalizing this model changes how leaders read diagrams, contracts, and incident reports. You stop asking only whether the satellite is secure. You start asking how an attacker could move between space, ground, and link, and where the organization actually has leverage.
Architecture reviews become less about exotic scenarios and more about concrete decisions around command authentication, key management, onboard autonomy, logging, telemetry, and vendor access. Governance conversations shift from generic compliance language to explicit allocations of mission risk, assurance expectations, and communication obligations when something goes wrong.
The practical next step is not to build an in-house space agency. It is to ask better questions and set clearer expectations with the programs, vendors, and partners that already touch space.
Which current or planned services depend on satellites or spaceborne data in ways that matter for safety, availability, or trust? How are those missions architected end-to-end, including vendors and regulators? Where are you assuming away physics or governance constraints because they are uncomfortable? Bringing those questions into roadmap discussions, procurement reviews, and incident exercises will not make you an orbital engineer. It will make you a better leader for an era of spaceborne dependency.
And when the screens in that ops room start to look just a little off, your teams will have fewer surprises and more prepared options. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.